everybody.
Welcome to Lady Vibe.
Your podcast for
Better well-being.
welcome to our new episode. Thank you for tuning in or watching. Um, on our Facebook page, we received a comment from an audience who just finished her chemotherapy for breast cancer. She is curious to know what she can do to prevent the cancer from coming back again. We know how
Sure.
dramatic it is to hear the news about having cancer, and for all survivors, they want to know what they can do to prevent it from coming back again. So to address her question, I think there is no better candidate than Dr. William J. McCarthy from UCLA, who has spent his whole career doing interventional studies to figure out what works to reduce risk of cancer and chronic diseases. Dr. McCarthy is a full professor at the Center for Cancer Prevention and Control Research and also UCLA Kaiser Permanente Center for Health Equity. We are so thrilled to have him come to our studio today. Dr. McCarthy, I would like you to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Ning and Rachel, for your kind invitation to be on your podcast. I'm delighted to share what I know about behavioral strategies to minimize risk of cancer and other diseases. And there is no magic bullet, but there are practical steps that people can take that will make a significant change in their risk if they adhere to recommended lifestyle choices. And if I might, I'd like to pull up some slides.
Actually, I heard that you're doing a very interesting study right now about like how to improve people's like improving gut microbial composition, how that affects people's risk of breast cancer recurrence. Is that right?
Yes. So maybe 13 years ago, I encountered research linking food choices to changes in the gut microbiota. And what struck me about that research is that you can see changes in the gut microbes in the space of days instead of the months that it takes for people to register a significant change in inflammation or a change in their body mass index. And so just from the point of view of seeing an effect sooner rather than later, I was intrigued. And the more I looked into the importance of the gut microbes, the more I realized, wow, this has been a missing ingredient in understanding the relationship between lifestyle choices and disease outcomes. So, even though I hadn't had the microbiology training that most people have who want to study the gut microbes, I just became so intrigued. I immediately collaborated with other UCLA experts on the gut microbiota, including Xiaoping Li, who's the chief of the Division of Clinical Nutrition. And so, assembling a team, we proposed looking at the relationship between diet and breast cancer incidence. And fortunately, we were funded by the California Breast Cancer Research Fund to do a pilot study. It involved 30 participants, of whom 27 ended up going entirely through the trial, having participating in all of the intervention sessions, and then allowing us to collect fecal samples both at baseline and at 6 months follow-up. So I'm happy to share some preliminary results from that study. But before I do that, I do want to talk about what the consensus science is on reducing risk of a variety of cancers, not just breast cancer. And for that, I want to call up the slides. And let me see if I can. So I want to start with the American Institute for Cancer Research recommendations for lifestyle choices that will minimize risk of a variety of cancers, not just breast cancer. And they are allied with the World Cancer Research Fund. And they over 2 decades, they've come out with 3 overviews of the world literature linking dietary choices and other lifestyle choices with cancer outcomes. And so these are their lifestyle recommendations based on the world literature. And so I've featured here 9 of their 10 recommendations. So we'll go through some of these boxes, but just know that the most important one in terms of influencing the gut microbes is the one on the far left upper corner, and that's eating a diet rich in whole grains, minimally processed vegetables, minimally processed fruits, and beans. If people do, if they focus on that, that will just by itself significantly reduce the risk of cancer. And if they are cancer survivors, the same thing applies to cancer recurrence. You will most effectively reduce your risk of breast cancer recurrence by eating this kind of diet. But it takes more than just eating the right kind of foods. It's also avoiding problematic food choices. And so the American Institute for Cancer Research says, try to minimize your consumption of processed meats, red meats, and especially sausage, pepperoni, salami, bologna. Those processed meats are very consistently associated with increased risk of cancer. The American Institute for Cancer Research recommends that we all eat a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and beans. And what we now know from the study of the gut microbiota is that the reason for this recommendation is that these foods are richest in the fiber and the polyphenol that are substrate for the microbes. When the microbes are well fed, they do really good things for the host, particularly the generation of short chain fatty acids, which include acetate, propionate, and butyrate. But you don't have to know those words to know that when there's high levels of these short chain fatty acids, then the host gets to enjoy higher levels of glucagon-like peptide 1. And you probably recognize GLP-1 as the magic ingredient of the miracle weight loss drugs like Wegovy, Ozempic, and Zepbound.
Super helpful.
So whole grains can include quinoa and corn. So corn on the cob is a whole grain, and wheat berries. Cracked wheat is a form of whole grain.
Okay.
And the if you look at a product that's produced that claims to be multigrain, often the multigrain breads are not. They don't feature the richness of fiber that is implied by the term multigrain. So
What bread
so
would you
it's
recommend?
best to go to like Sprouts and get the whole grains from the canisters.
Okay.
Typically, the grains that you find in packages are not really, they may feature some whole grains, but proportionally, most of it is refined grain. So multigrain bread is mostly refined grain. And so to the extent that is possible, go for oatmeal, go for cracked wheat, go for bulgur. These whole grain choices are going to be better for you than getting packaged stuff that claims to be multigrain.
Do you recommend us to make our own bread? Again, all the whole grain ingredients, make our own bread.
Where do we
I
start?
don't
What
know.
kind of bread?
I cannot imagine that. Like I have to buy bread from the market, just for what we can do. What kind of food would you recommend?
Yeah. So, I take as my touchstone as to where you can find people modeling the best combination of lifestyle behaviors. And I often cite Japan as the example. And how much bread do the Japanese eat?
They do eat a lot of white rice, though. With
They
the
eat a lot of white
sushi.
rice instead of brown rice, and brown rice is the better choice from a whole grain perspective. But they eat so much more than we do in the way of seaweed and vegetables, that they still get way more fiber than we do, even though Americans are more likely, if they eat any rice, to eat brown rice than the Japanese. So you're right, the Japanese could do even better than they're currently doing if they would eat brown rice instead of white rice. But overall, their diet is way superior than ours.
Bill, I think the magic word you mentioned is minimally processed, right? Because I try to add more beans to our diet, but my son just loves, the bush
Bush's beans.
yeah, Bush's beans, has a lot of salt and
Bush's baked
other things
beans.
in there, and also they also like refried beans. Um, we use that for burritos, for tacos. Uh, I guess, those are not our best choice, right?
So I've come to the conclusion, and others have also endorsed this, that the dietary patterns that accumulated over thousands of years of experimentation by our ancestors were optimally healthful for us, and that the problem with the industrialization of food is that in the process of having shelf stable foods that are very convenient and have a lot of calories at low cost, is that we have progressively been starving the microbes.
Oh.
And it's turned out that the microbes, when we starve them, we end up hurting ourselves. We think we're just being a little selfish, making things optimal for human hosts and less optimal for our microbial allies. But in fact, it turns out that through evolution, we've made a compact with the microbes. 90% of them are obligate anaerobes. They can't survive out in the oxygen-rich environment. They have to be in an oxygen-poor environment, like in our intestines. And so the compact was that we feed them, and then they will biotransform some of the substrate that we give them into things that the host needs, including most of our B vitamins, and including the metabolites that I told you about, the short chain fatty acids, which then generate increases in the concentration of hormones like GLP-1. And GLP-1 controls glucose. It's a way of treating diabetes, but it's also a way of keeping people thinner than they otherwise would be. So one of the downsides to starving the microbes, it turns out, is that we end up not knowing how to stop eating. Because historically, we depended on the microbes to tell us when to stop eating. But if we don't feed them, they can't send the stop signal. And the result is that we keep eating and eating and eating. The microbes continue to be dissatisfied because we're no longer giving them the fiber and the polyphenols that they need.
So let me ask you this. So to feed the microbes, so the microbes can signal that we're full, what is the best way to do that? What is a process? I think you made some really super helpful points. So I think my first question is, how do we eat to optimize sort of that, optimal absorption, right? And then the second one is, how do we feed the microbes so that they are able to appropriately signal?
So, there are practical strategies such as eating a variety of colors and eating minimally processed foods that will help feed the microbes. So minimally processed basically means nothing canned, and try to limit your consumption of packaged goods. So as most Americans know, the dietary guidelines for Americans encourages half the plate to be devoted to fruits and vegetables. And what that means, when you go shopping, half of the time that you spend shopping should be spent in the produce section, where it's not packaged, where it's not canned. It's out there without labels, because they're so good in terms, in nutritional terms, that they don't need labels. The consumer just knows by purchasing a greater variety of fruits and vegetables, they're going to end up doing a better job of feeding their gut microbes than by depending on packages and cans that have all sorts of, advertising messages to the effect, oh, this product is really good for your health. Well, not as good as those unlabeled products that you find in the produce section.
Bill, how about I do buy canned beans and canned unfrozen vegetables, like frozen edamame and other cut vegetables, because I'm so busy. A lot of times, like, especially for lunch, like I don't have time to prepare a full, like, wholesome meal, like what you mentioned. Um, are they okay, like, to use?
Oh, beans in a can are better than no beans at all. So yes, if your only choice is canned beans or no beans, then I would say go for the canned beans. But if it's a choice of beans that you cooked at home versus beans in a can, the beans cooked at home are going to be healthier. And part of the reason for that is that the canned beans almost always have excess sodium. And Americans, 100,000 of them are dying each year from excess sodium. And so we need to be minimizing our intake of salt at the same time that we should be eating more fiber-rich foods like beans. So what I've done is I have an Instant Pot, and I know not everybody can afford an Instant Pot, but an Instant Pot can take what, with garbanzos, it takes three hours on the stove to cook up the garbanzo beans, but it takes only half an hour in the Instant Pot. So you can save a fair amount of time. Plus, I make it my business on the weekends to cook up soup, to cook up dishes, where then I take a soup pot and I take portions, individual sized portions. I put them in the glass containers and then freeze them. And then during the week when I'm very busy, I just take out a container and put it in the microwave and zap it for, 6 minutes or more. And, presto, I've got a minimally processed food and also beans that are better than anything I can get from the grocery store.
What about so on the protein side of things? Obviously, this talks about limiting consumption of red meat and other processed meat. So I would assume, in my mind, the translation of processed meat is lunch meat, right, or things like that. So what are the easiest ways to, all Americans are all about efficiency. So what are the easiest ways to prepare meat? I think you mentioned cooking on the weekends, but what can we do to sort of move towards non-processed meat consumption? And, how can we sort of limit, those red meats, and as opposed to, let's just call it chicken or, some of the other meat sources?
So if they can afford it, Americans should be eating more fish, and particularly wild fish as opposed to farm-raised fish. So the American Heart Association says that Americans should be eating fish at least twice a day. And if you live in Japan and live the way the Japanese do, you have fish every day. And this is part of the reason why the Japanese have lower rates of breast cancer than we do, and have lower rates of a variety of diseases, and live up to 7 years longer than Americans do. It's because they're getting their protein preferentially from fish. And the difference between wild fish and farm-raised fish is that the farm-raised fish, while they still have the omega-3 fatty acids that salmon is known for, or that many cold water fish are known for, they also have an equal amount of saturated fat, because salmon that are not allowed to exercise end up accumulating a lot of saturated fat when, the farm-raised context doesn't allow them to swim very much. Whereas the wild salmon, boy, do they exercise a lot going up those streams, before laying their eggs. And the end result is that the wild salmon has very little saturated fat, plenty of omega-3 fatty acids. And the omega-3 fatty acids are quite anti-inflammatory as opposed to the saturated fat, which is pro-inflammatory.
That makes sense.
And something similar applies to poultry. So if you can go for free-range poultry, now I know it's a little bit more expensive, but you end up with a better fat profile. And of course, most of the fat in the poultry is found in the skin. So it's probably good to remove the skin. But whatever fat there is, with the wild range, with the free-range poultry, you're going to end up with a healthier protein source.
What about supplements? So protein powders and things of that nature for people on the go. What are your thoughts on that?
So supplements are highly processed, and the key word to keep the microbes happy is minimally processed. And you might note that in this American Institute for Cancer Research slide, at the bottom right, it says, beware of supplements. So 1 a day is fine, but anything beyond that, consult with a physician before using, super physiological amounts of, say, vitamin C, because for some people, this may be dangerous. And particularly for the fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, it's really important to consult with a physician first before taking supplements.
This is great. And then on the physical activity, you talked earlier about inflammation and the impact of inflammation on sort of, we'll call it balancing the system. What is we've heard even last week we were talking about, resistance training and weight training is better for, obviously building muscles, but also decreasing, the spike of cortisol. So do you feel like that you sort of aligns with this recommendation as well?
Absolutely, particularly a huff and puff exercise. So elevating the heart rate is an important part of the benefits of exercise. And the reason for that, and this needs more research, but the theory is that because most of our commensal microbes are obligate anaerobes, the less oxygen, the better. And what happens during exercise, particularly huff and puff exercise, is that whatever oxygen there is in the intestine gets reduced significantly, because during huff and puff exercise, the body preferentially takes whatever oxygen there is in the body and moves it to the working muscles. And so there's a reduction by half in the concentration of oxygen in the gut during exercise. And under those conditions, the microbes thrive and they produce more short-chain fatty acids and increase GLP-1 even more. And so that's part of the reason why exercise is associated with weight control. It's not because of the burning of calories. It's because the microbes end up producing more short-chain fatty acids, thereby increasing GLP-1 and helping to increase the satiety signal that tells the body, no more appetite, not hungry.
So cardio is important. But how about weightlifting? When people are doing weightlifting, like their muscles are, being used extensively.
The tissue hypertrophy that occurs in the muscle as a result of weightlifting is good for storing excess glucose. So from a glucose management point of view, the more muscle you can accommodate through exercise, the better. And excess glucose is fuel for cancer. The tumors, their favorite fuel is glucose. So if there's excess glucose there, that increases the risk of cancer, if it exists, of spreading. So for people interested in reducing recurrence of cancer, building muscle is an important strategy.